Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy!
Howdy YouTube fam, Robbie Crawford here with another video. It is a pretty terrible day for weather outside, so it looks like practice putting may not even be in the cards for us today. And I thought, what can we do to scratch that disc golf itch? And disc dyeing popped into my head. What is disc dyeing, you ask? Well, some of you have discs that look like this, beautiful factory stamp on it, and maybe you're wondering, how do I make it look custom like, I don't know, this? A little Greninja action? Well, it's a pretty easy process, and I want to show you step by step how it's done. So, let's jump right in. First and foremost, you're going to need a disc. You can use different types of discs, but usually the starter plastics, the DX or the lighter plastics of each of the brands, won't dye as well, so you want to go for a higher quality plastic. Today we'll be using a Star plastic by Innova, but yes, any of the Prime Champion plastics will do. Next, you're going to need some painter's tape. Painter's tape is crucial for a certain part of the process, as well as some duct tape. I'll explain that in a second. Your vinyl, you can use, I use vinyl, Oracle vinyl for cutting. You can also use contact paper if you'd like to do that. Shaving cream will be needed later, we'll get to that. And then what are you using to dye the disc? There are two different types of dyes that I found to be effective. This iDye Poly, you're gonna mix together, and then RIT fabric dye, but make sure you get the synthetic fabric dye, because if you don't get the synthetic, it won't hold as well to the plastic. You're gonna mix them up with water, and then I actually use dish soap as well. And then once it's all together, it stays in this beautiful jar that you can use later for different dyes. So you'll have those. The next thing you're gonna need is a stencil. The stencil is pretty critical for the dyeing process. It shows you what you're going to be putting onto the disc, and you'll need an X-Acto knife to cut out that stencil. The last thing that I use is I have a stock pot that specifically is used for dyeing. That way my wife doesn't hate me when I put fabric dye inside of her different pots and pans. And then the funnel helps get it all back inside to the jar. So that's all you're gonna need for your dyeing. Let's jump in.
So we're going to jump into hyperdrive here, and the rest of the video will be a little fast. I'm just cutting on a 1 foot by 1 foot piece of vinyl, and the duct tape is put on top of painter's tape so that it holds it down firmly in place. Next thing you're going to do is take your printed out stencil, cut it out a little bit, and then frame it in the middle of your piece of vinyl, and then tape it down using painter's tape. Once again, making sure to keep it nice and tight. Next comes the nitty-gritty part of dyeing your disc, and that is cutting out your stencil. You're going to use your X-Acto knife, and be sure to take it nice and slow as you walk down this process. You're going to carve out the pieces that you want to be exposed to the dye, so be careful what you're cutting and how you're cutting. Make sure you keep your corners nice and tight. I'm going to jump forward in the process. It took about 15 minutes to cut this stencil out entirely. Your next step is to slowly peel off the stencil, and it should leave a remaining mark in your vinyl like this. This is probably my favorite part of the process, and it's called weeding. It's where you're going to remove the parts that you've cut out of your vinyl, exposing what your dye should look like. Also, feel free to cut your large sections into smaller pieces to make it easier to pull off. Once your stencil is fully weeded, you're going to then apply painter's tape over the entirety of your stencil so that it'll stay in place on the transfer. A pro tip is to stick it to yourself before sticking it to the vinyl, that way it doesn't hold as tight. Now comes the acetone that was subtly mentioned in the supplies. You're going to use that and wipe off the factory stamp. It should come right off, and then run it under hot water. I also make sure to rub the acetone and fully clean off the disc before this next step, which is to separate the back of the vinyl from your stencil. Peel slowly. You want to make sure that your stencil stays stuck to the painter's tape. Now for the most nerve-wracking part, sticking your disc to the stencil. Center it, push it down, and make sure you evenly press it down onto your stencil. You notice there that I'm pressing around the stencil, and that's just to make sure that all of the vinyl is making contact with the disc. Next, you're going to very slowly peel back your painter's tape from the stencil making sure that none of the vinyl is pulling up as you pull. The final step in preparation is pushing around your stencil, making sure that no air bubbles are near the edges. Finally, you're going to wrap the rest of the remaining vinyl around the disc, making a nice little pillowcase of vinyl for your disc. Pro tip is to attach 2 pieces of vinyl to the back of your disc as handles that will be extremely helpful for this next part. What you're going to do is you're going to open your die and you're going to slowly pour it into your stock pot, getting it ready. Turn the burner onto a medium or low setting. Remember those handles? You're going to grab hold of those and slowly place your disc into the die. Now make sure that when you press it in there, you're going to give it a couple presses down, not to submerge it, but to make sure that all of the disc is being covered. Then give it a nice slow spin and get ready to wait. Not too long though. You're just going to wait 3 to 5 minutes. You don't want the water to boil. You're not trying to burn your disc. After that, pull it out using your handles. Once again, run it over to the sink and rinse it under some hot water. The hot water will also make it easier to remove your vinyl. And as you pull away your vinyl, you should see your beautiful new stencil. Sometimes the vinyl does leave a little bit of residue, so keep some Goo Gone handy to remove that residue.
That wraps it up for today's video, y'all. I really enjoyed how this disc turned out, and I look forward to seeing what dies you guys do in the future. So if you haven't already, follow me on social media. Links are below. Look forward to hearing from you in the future. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see in the future. So hit that like button, subscribe, and keep throwing some discs.